Hello, in this video I just wanted to present a way of working with archetypal themes and patterns which I thought might be interesting to people and might be helpful, if my dog allows me to. He's quite active at the moment. But this comes from our going through Brand's book, and I highly recommend getting Brand's book. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. But in part of the book, it deals with certain patterns that Brand considers to occur in the raising of children, basically, and basically in the role of the mother and the father with relation to sons and daughters, in the way that they are basically prepared for life, prepared for the outer journey. And one of the things here that came up was the way that the patriarch helps the boy to become the warrior, and the way the matriarch helps the daughter to become affirmed as the actress and this kind of character, and that these are both now, and all of these archetypes are part of the outer journey. So you can see this is all to do with preparing for the outer journey, preparing for life. And part of the stuff that comes from this is the idea that boys need to sort of like gain clarity of mind and spirit first, and then soul and body follow, and girls need to have their soul and body sort of affirmed, and that connection made first, and then spirit and mind follow. Now, for me, I'm very aware that this isn't always the case. I'm very aware that people don't always follow this pattern, that boys don't always follow that masculine pattern, that girls don't always follow that feminine pattern. I know it wasn't like that with me. And so I'm very careful with this, that you need to actually look at an individual, listen to an individual, see what's actually going on with them, and see what processes are real for them. One of my responses to this, though, was to try and see, well, what would be an alternative to this particular little story, it was couched almost as a fairy story with a king and a queen and a prince and a princess, being the mother and father and the son and daughter. So I thought, well, what other sort of story could emerge, And so I ended up writing an alternative fairy story, essentially, which of course isn't really a children's fairy story. It's more my fairy story, in a sense, of what could occur, what could happen, what sort of forces come into play if, for instance, you're a boy and the normal masculine path of development does not fit you, does not call to you, does not work for you. What happens then? And so this was an experiment in that. So again, it's not really a fairy story, but it's a kind of an exercise in creative imagination, an experiment. And part of what I did with this was just to simply let imagination run, but I also at times would draw a rune stone for a particular character to see if that could give me a clue as to where this was going, or the nature of that character and things like that. So that's another thing that occurred there. So combining creative imagination with basically active divination to come up with new kinds of stories, to investigate, to allow yourself to go deeper into the processes you're investigating, and produce something from them. So that's what I did here, and so I'm just presenting that to see how it turned out, and in case it's of interest to other people. The Emperor Who Never Was.
There once was a prince of a perfect kingdom, and he was called Rado. The prince had a sister, and the princess was lively, beautiful, and intelligent. Their father was the emperor, magnificent and powerful, wise and strong. The mother was the empress, equally great and cultured, patron of all beauty and arts in the kingdom, and careful of all that occurred under her influence. Princess Isa was rightly proud of her position and her inheritance. All was perfect with her. Her value ordained by her father, her life prepared by her mother. She was yet young and would have much to learn, but the ways were handed down to her, and they fitted as if they were a tailored dress. Prince Rado, though, was different. The prince loved his father greatly, like a shining, beneficent sun in his world, but he was not the apple of his father's eye. He looked upon his father's sword, and he knew that in this sword lay the power that allowed the kingdom to thrive, the power to bring peace. But Rado loved the sheath more than the sword, for he sensed that if the sword was in its sheath, then its power was truly working. But he knew, with growing and unavoidable unease, that to defend peace and prevent chaos, the sword would have to be unsheathed by the one that held it eventually, and his hands were not made for swords. Rado would inevitably spend more time with his mother, and she looked upon her child kindly in his gentleness. Rado was more at home in her world, and he would spend many hours wandering her gardens and her meadows. But he knew that the only way to stay here was to remain a child and never grow, but become like the flowers of the meadow, a season's memory quickly lost forever. The court had a jester who entertained the emperor, foolish, funny, and outrageous by turns. He could say what no one else could to the emperor, and the imperial family felt a similar freedom with him in return. His name was Beruk, and increasingly Rado found himself keeping company with him as he got older. His father, his first love, only welcomed his devotion ambivalently, for he sensed no heirhood in his child, and Rado gravitated to the dishevelled, colourful figure of Beruk. Here was a man, part child, part wolf, like a florid rip in the royal tapestry, a rip that maybe Rado could slip out of, or something else slip in through. Here was a man who could see the boy that Rado was. It was early winter, and the firelight played over Beruk's unquestionably odd face, with his blue eyes verging on violet, his goatee beard, and his broad mouth that turned his face into a laughing mask or a stoic bearer of life's bemusement. The flames and shadows played over Beruk's listening form, the joy of yet another year staying in possession of his head, having settled into a profound calmness that lay behind his mania. So here, Rado unburdened himself of all his doubts and disappointments, his sadness and hurt, and all the first tender shoots of despair growing in him. "Well, my prince, that is a fix, and I see you have been heading to see old Beruk for a long time now, and I'm not usually a good destination for people." "We could dance, of course, or burn cakes in the kitchen. I could show you where they put all the broken furniture in the castle, or tell you about the forest." "Yes, the forest. I see your eyes light up at that. But burning cakes is a lot of fun." "Okay, the forest it is." And with that, Beruk became very serious, as if he were suddenly another person, and the firelight played in his eyes, and the shadows seemed to collect about him, and he became shaggier somehow, deeper browed, hunched. "There is one in the forest who could help you. You are a strange lad, and she is the strangest of all, and a sorceress." "A sorceress? Where in the forest is she?" asked Rado. "She lives in an abode no one has ever seen, but it is near the lake in the forest's middle. In autumn it is covered with mist. In winter it may freeze, and in summer it lies sleepily in the heat, swarming with dragonflies and gnats, but the best time is said to be late spring. She can be found on a mild night, wandering under a full moon with her companions then. So it is said." "Thank you," said Rado, and he gave Beruk a kiss on the cheek, at which the spell seemed to be broken, and the jester let out a cackle, but with a warm and crooked smile he winked at the prince, and hustled off down the hall, with his small dog following him, but not before whispering to Rado, "Not a word of this to your mother." It was a week before Rado's 14th birthday. The emperor and empress had been receiving eligible suitors for their daughter's hand in marriage, who was now 17 years old. a young foreign prince of 24 was introduced. Rado looked upon him, handsome, strong, already mature, and a fire moved within Rado at the sight of his every movement, and he was transported beyond himself. Then there was the immediate realization that, just as with his father, he would be invisible and unsought by any such man. And then the realization that this foreign prince was what his father wanted in him. His father wanted what he was not. The trap set around his heart was clear as steel now. His not being was all he had, and he would take this one power to the forest. So on the night of May Eve, a full moon, Rado set off for the forest, past the chambers of the castle, past the decorative gardens, past the moat of the inner wall, past the sheltered meadows within the outer walls, and out into the countryside, and so to the forest. The moon rose just above the trees in the fragrant night of sap and earth, and Rado made his way into the forest, carrying an oil lantern to light his way. It was unlike the gardens of his mother, even the meadows, so alive was it with life unorganized by human hand. He knew the direction of the lake at the center of the forest, and found a path that greatly aided his footsteps. Others had been here before, he could at least see that. He walked for what seemed like hours, though he had no real sense of time. A minute could contain a multitude, and a multitude could fly by. A wolf howled under the dark canopy somewhere in the distance, but the wolf was not the trap set about his heart, and he did not fear it. Onwards he went, until the ground sloped downward gently, and then he saw the glint of light. It was the full moon reflected in the lake, showing through the trees. Rado sat against a tree and waited, in the peace that was filled with small sounds. His eyes had adjusted to the moonlight, and all seemed to open up within and without him, as if we were floating in the primordial moment that carried all life on its back from the very beginning, and was still here, on this forest night, by a lake, amongst the trees. The prince must have dozed off, because he awoke with a start, acutely alert and suddenly knowing where to go. He got up, and without even taking the lamp with him, he headed back off into the forest, his feet finding their way easily to a clearing, and there in the middle of the clearing was a woman. She wore a blue dress that yet seemed to reflect the ghostly light of the moon, and her long hair was dark, and as soon as Rado got to the edge of the clearing, she looked up and turned to him. Rado knew that he was to approach her. For the first time he felt some fear and apprehension. He felt like he was drifting forward, not walking, and the moon above seemed to hum with the music reflected by the earth below, tenor to bass, but deeper, deeper, the sound of a million bees swarming. The woman smiled, and now he could see her face, round, faintly shining, almond-eyed. She nodded. He heard in his head, "You are of us." Then from behind her came forward another figure, male, powerful, naked, with a thick beard and long hair, and great antlers rose from his head up towards the sky. A red fire seemed to coalesce around him and splash onto the ground. The antlered figure looked at Rado and seemed to recognize something in him, and smiled with his dark eyes. Rado could feel it. She recognized him. The antlered one did not reject him, but wanted what he was. She spoke 4 words. "Your name means wheel," and then clapped her hands. Rado leapt in the air, and when he came down to earth he was a pig. A second time the pig leapt in the air and was a goat. A third time the goat leapt in the air and was a snake. The moon descended, a great ship of luminous light, down into the clearing, and an old man with hare's ears looked out, through wise ancient eyes, as if about to say something. Rado awoke, cold, stiff, against the tree trunk next to the lake. The moon was low in the sky. It would soon be dawn. He headed back towards the castle, not noticing the stone in his pocket. The next day, Rado knew what he must do, and he went straight to his sister. Rado was the heir, the crown prince. He only had the power of not being, so he would collapse his power, relinquish his crown, and become what he might be. His sister would become empress in his stead and claim her inheritance. Princess Isa listened intently, at first looking at him as if he were mad, then with a flush of realization, and finally for the first time it seemed to Rado that the ice in her nature started to melt. She would not be perfect, but instead would rule over her own realm, a realm whose pattern she would not simply reproduce, but help to weave. On his return from the forest, Rado found a rune stone in his pocket, and from this he was able to see his way. It was marked with the rune Wunjo, joy, and this was now his guide, and from this he gave his sister the pet name Win, which means the same. Whatever the price, Rado understood that it was joy that must be served for us to live, and to look for what would truly give joy to the needful. Rado looked for Berok to talk with him again, but no one could find the jester. He had disappeared on the night of the full moon. Rado went on many adventures when he left the castle, and though he never saw Berok again, he saw the same light that the jester had in his eyes in many welcome guides. As for the emperor, he and the empress were happy to not send their daughter away to a distant kingdom, and he came to respect his son as man enough to be different, while the empress took a conservative delight in her daughter's position. Eventually Rado, whose name means wheel, did settle in a cottage with a companion, and did many quiet and marvellous things, always remembering the lady and the antlered one who had shown him the love he truly needed. He grew wise and eventually died, as all mortals do. But you may see him on a late spring night, under a full moon, near a lake, among the trees, if you have need. The Emperor Who Never Was.